My ex-wife and I ran into each other at the restaurant 7 years after our divorce. Long time no see, I said. She looked at my current wife beside me and froze. Without a word, she fled as if she'd seen the Grim Reaper. Moments later, my phone buzzed with a message from her. Divorce her now? Your new wife is. You know that feeling when you're having a perfectly good day and then life decides to take a baseball bat to your kneecaps? Yeah, well, welcome to my Tuesday night. 7 years, 7 whole years, after I signed those divorce papers with enough enthusiasm as a death row inmate picking his last meal, and there she was. Isla, my ex-wife, standing in the same downtown restaurant where I was supposed to be celebrating an early anniversary with Serena, my new wife, like some kind of cosmic joke that nobody asked for. The Meridian Grill wasn't exactly a hole-in-the-wall joint where you'd expect to bump into ghosts from your past. This place had cloth napkins, wine lists that required a small business loan, and waiters who pronounced foreign words without breaking a sweat. Serena had picked it because she said we needed to celebrate properly, which in married speak apparently meant dropping $200 on food that came in portions small enough to fit in a shot glass. I was halfway through explaining to Serena why truffle oil was basically just overpriced regular oil with delusions of grandeur when I caught sight of familiar auburn hair across the dimly lit dining room. My fork stopped midway to my mouth, loaded with what the menu had pretentiously called grass-fed beef medallions with seasonal microgreens. Translation: small steak with fancy weeds. Isla was standing near the hostess station, probably waiting for a table, looking like she'd rather be getting a root canal without anesthesia. The years had been kind to her, I'll give her that. Still had that runner's build, still carried herself like she owned whatever room she walked into. But something was off. She looked haunted, like someone who'd been carrying around a secret so heavy it was bending her spine. Our eyes met across the restaurant floor, and I swear the temperature dropped 10 degrees. She froze completely, her face going from normal human color to somewhere between chalk and fresh snow. You know that look people get when they realize they've been caught red-handed doing something they shouldn't? Yeah, that was Isla's face, except she hadn't been doing anything except existing in the same zip code as me. My first instinct, because I'm apparently a glutton for punishment, was to try to smooth things over with humor. It's like a reflex. When things get awkward, crack a joke. When things get uncomfortable, make it worse by opening my mouth. So naturally, I raised my hand in a little wave and called out, "Long time no see," with all the casual confidence of a guy who definitely hadn't spent the better part of his therapy sessions talking about his trust issues. Isla's reaction was immediate and about as subtle as a freight train through a library. She looked at me, then shifted her gaze to Serena, who was currently studying the dessert menu with the concentration of a nuclear physicist. Then back to me. Then, without so much as a word, a nod, or even a middle finger for old time's sake, she turned and bolted for the exit like the building was on fire. And I mean bolted. This wasn't a graceful, "excuse me, I just remembered I left my iron on" kind of exit. This was full-on panic mode, complete with the chair-scraping symphony as she bumped into furniture on her way out. The hostess looked confused, a couple at the next table turned to stare, and our waiter, a guy named Jeremy who'd been hovering around our table like a well-dressed vulture, stopped mid-stride with his mouth hanging open. "Was that woman okay?" Serena asked, looking up from her menu with genuine concern. She had this way of caring about random strangers that used to make my heart do little backflips. Still did, actually. She looked upset. I forced what I hoped was a convincing smile, the kind you practice in the mirror when you're trying to convince yourself that everything's fine. "Just someone from the past," I said, reaching for my water glass because my mouth had suddenly gone drier than Arizona in August. "You know how it is." Serena nodded and went back to debating between the chocolate souffle and the creme brulee, apparently satisfied with my non-explanation. That's the thing about Serena. She trusted me. Completely, unconditionally, sometimes to the point where I wondered if she'd been dropped on her head as a child. It was refreshing after years of marriage to someone who questioned whether I was lying about what I had for lunch. But I couldn't shake the image of Isla's face. That wasn't just surprise or embarrassment. That was fear. Raw, honest-to-God terror, like she'd seen something that was going to give her nightmares for the next decade. What the hell could cause that kind of reaction? We'd parted on decent terms, all things considered. Sure, The divorce hadn't been a cakewalk, but we'd managed to divide our assets without hiring hitmen or burning down each other's houses. Minutes crawled by like they were stuck in molasses. Serena ordered the souffle, I pretended to care about coffee, and Jeremy continued to hover with the persistence of a used car salesman. I was just starting to convince myself that maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, that Isla's reaction was just normal awkwardness amplified by expensive wine and dim lighting, when my phone buzzed against my leg. Text message. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, probably spam about my car's extended warranty or some prince in Nigeria who needed my bank account information. But something made me look. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the same instinct that makes you slow down to look at car accidents. The message made my stomach drop faster than a roller coaster with commitment issues. Divorce her now. Your new wife is. And then nothing. The text just cut off like someone had been typing too fast and hit send by accident, or like they'd been interrupted mid-warning by something more urgent than my marital status. I stared at the screen, reading those words over and over until they burned themselves into my retinas. My hands were shaking. Actually shaking, like I was having some kind of medical episode. I excused myself from the table, mumbling something about needing the restroom, and practically sprinted across the restaurant floor. The men's room was mercifully empty, all black marble and mirrors that reflected my sudden pallor back at me in high definition. I gripped the sink edge until my knuckles went white, rereading the message for the 100th time. The unknown number meant nothing. Anyone could get a burner phone. But the urgency in those words, the way they'd been cut off, that felt real. That felt like someone trying to warn me about something they couldn't quite bring themselves to say. A knock on the bathroom door made me jump like I'd been electrocuted. Aaron, everything okay in there? Serena's voice, sweet and concerned, and completely unaware that my world had just tilted sideways. Fine. I called back, shoving my phone into my pocket like it was evidence of a crime. Just fine. Be right out. But I wasn't fine. Nothing was fine. Because deep in my gut, underneath all the rational explanations and logical dismissals, something was screaming that this wasn't a prank or a mistake or a coincidence. This was a warning, and warnings usually meant there was something to be warned about. As I walked back to our table, past the couples sharing intimate conversations and the business dinners conducting deals over appetizers, questions roared through my mind like a hurricane. What did Isla know? Why would she warn me? And what the hell did your new wife is mean? Serena smiled when I sat down, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. You look pale. Are you feeling all right? I squeezed back, forcing another smile. Just tired. Long day. But inside, everything had changed. The restaurant felt different now, like I was seeing it through someone else's eyes. The romantic lighting seemed sinister. The quiet conversations at other tables sounded like conspiracies. And Serena, my beautiful, trusting wife, suddenly felt like a stranger wearing a familiar face. The souffle arrived, picture perfect and probably delicious. Serena took a bite and made that little sound of appreciation that usually made me grin like an idiot. Tonight, it just made me wonder what else I didn't know about the woman sitting across from me. I was about to find out. You know what they say about curiosity in cats? Yeah, well, apparently I'm part feline because I spent the next 18 hours obsessing over that half-finished text message like it was the final clue in a murder mystery. I tried everything to distract myself. Worked late, binged Netflix, even attempted to organize my sock drawer, which should tell you just how desperate I was getting. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Isla's face, pale as moonlight and twice as haunting. I'd almost convinced myself to delete the message and pretend it never happened when my phone buzzed again at midnight. Same unknown number. This time, the message was complete. Meet me tomorrow. Please. It's not about us. It's about her. Against every rational bone in my body. And trust me, I've got plenty of rational bones after years of therapy and self-help books. I found myself typing back, Harbor Cafe, 10 a.m. Because apparently, when your ex-wife sends cryptic warnings about your current wife, the logical response is to meet for coffee like you're planning a book club. Harbor Cafe was one of those hipster joints where the baristas had more tattoos than a biker convention and the coffee cost more than my first car payment. It was also neutral territory, the kind of place where you could have a civilized conversation without anyone calling the cops or throwing pastries. I arrived 15 minutes early because punctuality is apparently my superpower, and spent the time nursing a latte that tasted like burnt dreams and regret. Isla walked in at exactly 10 o'clock because she'd always been annoyingly punctual too. 7 years had changed her, but not in the ways you'd expect. She looked tired, like someone who'd been running on caffeine and determination for too long. Her hair was shorter than I remembered, cut in one of those sharp bobs that screamed, "I made some major life decisions at a salon." She was wearing jeans and a sweater that had seen better decades, and she moved like someone who was constantly looking over her shoulder. She ordered black coffee, no sugar, no cream, no nonsense, and slid into the booth across from me without the usual small talk that normal people engage in. "No, how've you been?" Or "You look good," or "Funny weather we're having." Just straight to business, which should have been my first clue that this wasn't going to be your average catch-up session with the ex. Without saying a word, she reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the scarred wooden table like she was dealing cards in a high-stakes poker game. I unfolded it carefully, expecting maybe a legal document or a medical report or possibly her grocery list. What I got instead was a mugshot. The woman in the photo had blonde hair instead of dark, a different name at the bottom, Vivian Cross, and was clearly several years younger. But the bone structure was close enough to make my chest tighten with recognition. The eyes were the same shape, the nose had the same slight upturn, and there was something about the way she held her mouth that made my coffee suddenly taste like acid. "She goes by Serena now," Isla whispered, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise of grinding coffee beans and pretentious indie music. But that's not her first life. 10 years ago, she was Vivian Cross. Fraud charges in Arizona. Multiple counts. She got off on a technicality, but the damage was done. I stared at the mugshot, my brain doing mental gymnastics trying to reconcile the woman in the photo with the woman who made me pancakes every Sunday morning and left little love notes in my lunch. "This is insane," I said, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. "This could be anyone. People have doppelgangers all the time." Isla's laugh was bitter as black coffee. "She befriended me back then, Aaron. This was during our last year of marriage, when things were getting rocky. She showed up at my yoga class, started asking innocent questions. About you, your business, your accounts, your habits. I thought she was just being friendly, maybe a little nosy. But she was collecting information. The cafe suddenly felt too small, too warm, too full of people who didn't know that my world was currently imploding over a $20 latte. You're telling me that Serena, my wife, somehow orchestrated our divorce?" She planted doubts. Isla continued, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup like it was keeping her anchored to reality. "Little things at first. Did I know you'd been working late? Had I noticed any changes in your behavior? Was I sure you were happy?" She was like a therapist from hell, asking all the right questions to make me paranoid about everything. I remembered those final months of our marriage, how Isla had become increasingly suspicious, questioning my every move, accusing me of things I'd never even thought about doing. At the time, I'd chalked it up to stress from her job and the normal wear and tear that marriages go through. I'd never considered that someone might be pulling the strings behind the scenes like some kind of relationship puppet master. "That's why our marriage cracked," Isla said, her voice shaking with either anger or grief or both. "Not because we fell out of love, not because we wanted different things. Because someone systematically poisoned our trust in each other. And now she's with you. Aaron, this isn't an accident. This is a pattern." I pushed back hard because that's what you do when someone tries to tell you that your reality is actually a carefully constructed lie. "That's impossible. Serena's kind, caring. She makes me tea when I can't sleep. She listens to my problems. She actually gives a damn about my day." Isla gave me a look that could have pierced steel. "And when did your fatigue start? The racing heart? The insomnia that she's so conveniently helping you with?" The question hit me like a slap across the face. My sleep problems had started about a month after Serena and I got married. Nothing dramatic, just a gradual increase in restlessness, a heart that seemed to beat a little too fast, a constant feeling of being tired even after a full night's sleep. Serena had been so concerned, so helpful, brewing me special chamomile tea and insisting I see a doctor. "You're being paranoid," I said, but the words felt hollow. "Stress causes insomnia. I've been working long hours, dealing with new marriage adjustments. It's normal. Don't dismiss me, Aaron. Please. Isla leaned forward, her eyes intense. I know how this sounds. I know you think I'm the crazy ex-wife who can't let go. But I spent 2 years after our divorce wondering what went wrong, blaming myself, thinking I was losing my mind. When I finally figured out what happened, it was too late to fix us. But it's not too late for you. She reached across the table and grabbed my hand, her fingers cold as winter. Test it. Before you dismiss me, before you write me off as a bitter ex, test the tea. Test whatever she's giving you. If I'm wrong, you can tell me to go to hell, and I'll never bother you again. But if I'm right, she didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The implication hung in the air between us like smoke from a house fire. I sat there, staring at the mugshot of a woman who looked almost exactly like my wife, listening to my ex-wife tell me that my current marriage was built on a foundation of lies and possibly slow-acting poison. The rational part of my brain was screaming that this was insane, that Isla was clearly having some kind of breakdown, that there had to be a logical explanation for everything. But there was another part, a quieter voice in the back of my mind, that was whispering uncomfortable truths about timing and coincidences and the fact that my health problems had started right around the time I'd begun drinking Serena's specialty every night. I left the cafe with the mugshot burning a hole in my pocket and Isla's words echoing in my head like a broken record. The drive home was a blur of stop signs and traffic lights and the constant buzzing of questions I didn't want to ask. What if Isla was right? What if the woman I'd fallen in love with, married, and trusted with my life was actually someone else entirely? That night, when Serena handed me my usual chamomile tea with her usual loving smile, I forced myself to smile back and take the cup. But for the first time in months, I didn't drink it. Instead, I sat there holding the warm ceramic, staring into the amber liquid, and wondering if the woman who claimed to love me was actually trying to kill me. Her words clung to me like burrs for the rest of the day, scratching at every interaction, every gesture, every kind word. By the time I went to bed that night, I knew one thing for certain. I was either about to prove my ex-wife was crazy or discover that my current wife was a monster. You know that moment when you're standing at the edge of a cliff and you know you're about to jump, but you're not entirely sure if there's water below or just really expensive concrete. Yeah, that's exactly how I felt walking into my garage at 2 in the morning with a mason jar and the determination of a man who'd either lost his mind or was about to save his life. The tea was still sitting on my nightstand, exactly where I'd left it after pretending to take my usual pre-bedtime sips. Serena had been so pleased when I'd complimented the extra soothing blend she'd made, telling me how she'd added some new herbs she'd picked up at that fancy organic market downtown. The same market, I now realized with the kind of clarity that comes with paranoia, that she'd started frequenting right around the time my sleep problems began. Sealing that tea in a ball jar felt like I was collecting evidence for a crime that might not have happened yet. The amber liquid looked innocent enough. Hell, it smelled like every grandmother's remedy for insomnia since the dawn of time. But Isla's words kept rattling around in my head like loose change in a washing machine. Test it before you dismiss me. So here I was, sneaking around my own house like some kind of suburban spy, trying to figure out how to get chamomile tea analyzed without sounding like a complete lunatic. Turns out, when you're potentially being poisoned by your spouse, your social circle becomes remarkably limited. Who exactly do you call for that kind of favor? Hey buddy, mind testing this tea for toxins? My ex-wife thinks my current wife is trying to murder me. How's your Tuesday going? That's when I remembered Dr. Marcus Hale. We'd gone to college together, pledged the same fraternity, and spent 4 years convincing each other that beer was a food group and sleep was optional. Marcus had gone on to medical school while I pursued a business degree, but we'd stayed in touch over the years. More importantly, he ran a small diagnostics lab downtown that specialized in the kind of discreet testing that didn't require insurance claims or nosy questions. I called him the next morning, trying to sound casual while my heart was doing its best impression of a jackhammer. Marcus, hey, it's Aaron. Listen, I need a favor. A quiet one. There was a pause on the other end, the kind that suggested Marcus was either very busy or very suspicious. Define quiet, he said finally, and I could picture him in his lab coat, probably surrounded by test tubes and expensive equipment that could tell you everything about a person's body chemistry except why they made such terrible life choices. I need something tested. For toxins. And I need you to not ask questions about why. Another pause, longer this time. Marcus had always been the smart one in our group. The guy who could solve calculus problems in his head, while the rest of us were still trying to figure out what X meant. Aaron, are you in some kind of trouble? Maybe. Probably. I honestly don't know yet. I was standing in my office, staring out the window at suburban normalcy, kids riding bikes, neighbors walking dogs, mailmen delivering bills and catalogs like the world wasn't potentially falling apart one cup of tea at a time. But I need to know for sure before I make any decisions. Bring it in, he said finally. But you owe me dinner at that steakhouse you're always bragging about. 2 days later, my phone rang while I was pretending to work on quarterly reports and actually Googling things like digitalis poisoning symptoms and how to tell if your spouse is a sociopath. Marcus's name on the caller ID made my stomach drop faster than a broken elevator. You need to come in, he said without preamble. Now, the drive to his lab felt like it took about 17 hours when it was probably closer to 20 minutes. Marcus's office was all white walls and medical degrees, the kind of place that smelled like antiseptic and bad news. He was waiting for me with a manila folder and an expression that suggested I wasn't going to like what he had to say. Sit down, he said, which is never what you want to hear from a doctor. Aaron, you've been ingesting digitalis glycosides. Specifically, compounds found in foxglove. High concentration. This isn't accidental exposure. Someone's been dosing you systematically. The world tilted sideways, and for a moment I thought I might actually pass out right there in Marcus's office. Poison, I said, because apparently stating the obvious was all my brain could handle at the moment. Poison, he confirmed, flipping through test results that might as well have been written in ancient hieroglyphics for all I could understand them. Foxglove is particularly nasty because it mimics heart medication. In small doses over time, it causes exactly the symptoms you've been experiencing: fatigue, irregular heartbeat, insomnia. But if someone keeps increasing the dosage, my heart would stop. I finished, feeling like I was having an out-of-body experience. And it would look natural, like stress. Marcus nodded grimly. Middle-aged guy, works too much, recent marriage, financial pressures. A heart attack wouldn't raise any eyebrows. The coroner would probably blame it on lifestyle factors and call it a day. I sat there for a moment, trying to process the fact that someone I trusted, someone I'd pledged to love and honor, and all that other wedding nonsense, had been systematically trying to kill me with herbal tea. It was like finding out Santa Claus was actually a serial killer who specialized in chimney-related deaths. How long? I asked, because apparently I was a glutton for punishment. Marcus ran another test, something involving my hair, which I didn't know was possible, but then again, I'd learned a lot of uncomfortable things about forensic science in the past 48 hours. For weeks, he said, studying the results with the concentration of a man who solved puzzles for a living. Consistent doses, gradually increasing. Whoever's doing this knows exactly what they're doing. This is an amateur hour, Aaron. This is someone with knowledge of pharmacology, someone who understands how to make murder look like natural causes. I drove aimlessly after leaving Marcus's lab, my mind spinning like a washing machine on the fritz. Eventually, I found myself parked by the river, watching joggers and dog walkers go about their normal lives while I sat in my car, holding proof that my wife was trying to murder me with the efficiency of a professional hitman and the subtlety of a master chef. My phone buzzed with a text from Serena. Don't forget your tea tonight. You looked pale this morning. Love you. I stared at that message for a long time, reading it over and over until the words started to blur together. The casual concern, the loving reminder, the heart emoji at the end. It all felt like a performance now, like lines delivered by an actress who'd been playing the same role for months. My knuckles were white where I gripped the steering wheel, and I realized I was shaking again. Not from fear this time, but from rage. Pure, crystalline fury at being played for a fool, at being manipulated by someone who kissed me goodnight and then tried to poison me to death with chamomile tea and fake concern. But underneath the anger was something else, determination. Because now I had proof. Not paranoia, not wild theories from an ex-wife with questionable motives, but actual scientific evidence that someone was trying to kill me, and that someone was sleeping in my bed, cooking in my kitchen, and asking about my day like she gave a damn whether I lived to see tomorrow. The question now wasn't whether Serena was trying to murder me. The question was what I was going to do about it. You know what they don't teach you in marriage counseling? How to assemble a team when you discover your spouse is trying to murder you with herbal tea. Turns out, there's no handbook for My Wife is a Sociopathic Poisoner, a beginner's guide to not dying. So there I was, sitting in my car with scientific proof that someone wanted me dead, trying to figure out my next move like I was planning a heist instead of trying to save my own life. Step 1 was swallowing my pride, which tasted about as bitter as digitalis-laced chamomile. I called Isla, because apparently when your current wife is trying to kill you, your ex-wife starts looking like a pretty reliable ally. The irony wasn't lost on me. 7 years ago, I couldn't wait to get away from Isla, and now I was calling her for help because she might be the only person standing between me and a heart attack that would look suspiciously natural. I need to see you again, I said when she picked up, skipping the pleasantries because small talk seemed pretty pointless when you're discussing attempted murder. You were right. About everything. There was silence on the other end, the kind that stretches long enough to make you wonder if the call dropped or if the person on the other side is having a small breakdown. Finally, Isla spoke, her voice quiet and strained. How bad is it? Foxglove. For weeks of systematic poisoning. My friend Marcus tested the tea. High concentrations of digitalis glycosides. The words felt surreal coming out of my mouth, like I was reading lines from a really twisted episode of some crime drama. She's been dosing me every night, probably working up to a fatal heart attack. Isla made a sound that was half sob, half bitter laugh. Jesus, Aaron. I'm so sorry. I should have told you sooner, should have warned you the minute I figured it out. We met at her apartment, a small place across town that was nothing like the house we'd shared during our marriage. It was minimalist, almost Spartan, like she'd stripped away everything that wasn't absolutely necessary for survival. She made coffee, regular coffee, not the kind that came with a side of cardiac arrest, and we sat at her kitchen table while she told me the rest of the story. After our divorce, I couldn't let go of the feeling that something was wrong, she said, wrapping her hands around her mug like it was keeping her warm. I kept thinking about that woman from yoga class, Vivian. She'd disappeared right after our marriage fell apart, just vanished like she'd never existed. So I hired a private investigator. Isla reached into a manila envelope and pulled out a stack of papers that looked like they'd been photocopied from police files. Vivian Cross, alias Victoria Chun, alias Sarah Martinez. She's got a pattern, Aaron. She targets divorced men or men in troubled marriages. She befriends the wives, plants seeds of doubt, helps orchestrate the divorce, and then swoops in to comfort the grieving ex-husband. The photos showed the same woman with different hair colors, different names, but always the same bone structure. Always the same predatory smile. How many? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. At least 6 that we could find. 3 of them died within 2 years of marrying her. Heart attacks, all ruled natural causes. 2 others divorced her after becoming suspicious, but not before she'd cleaned out their bank accounts. Isla's voice was matter-of-fact, like she was discussing the weather instead of a serial killer's greatest hits. The PI thinks there are probably more, but she's good at covering her tracks. I stared at the evidence spread across Isla's kitchen table. Police reports, death certificates, newspaper clippings about tragic sudden deaths and mysterious heart ailments in otherwise healthy men. It was like looking at my own obituary, written in advance and just waiting for the right moment to be published. There's something else, Isla said, pulling out another document. She mentioned a name once, during a phone call I overheard. Maddox Rourke. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but the PI found a connection. Shell companies, money transfers, real estate purchases. She's not working alone, Aaron. This is organized. The idea that my attempted murder was some kind of business venture made my skin crawl. It was one thing to think that Serena had fallen out of love with me and decided poison was easier than divorce lawyers. It was something else entirely to realize that I was just another mark in what appeared to be a very profitable enterprise. But I couldn't handle this alone, and Isla, for all her good intentions, wasn't exactly equipped to take on a criminal organization. That's when I remembered Derek Voss, my oldest friend and the most paranoid person I'd ever met. Derek had done 2 tours in Afghanistan as a military police officer before getting into private security, and he'd spent the last decade convinced that everyone was either lying to him or trying to kill him. Turns out, in my case, he might have been right. Derek listened to my story with the kind of calm focus that made me remember why he'd been good at his job. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask stupid questions, didn't suggest that maybe I was overreacting. He just nodded along like attempted murder by herbal tea was a perfectly normal Tuesday afternoon conversation. First thing we need is surveillance, he said when I finished explaining the situation. Audio, video, whatever we can get. If she's planning to escalate, we need to catch it on record. Within hours, Derek had turned my house into something out of a spy movie. Hidden cameras and light fixtures, audio recorders disguised as electrical outlets, motion sensors that would alert us to any unusual activity. He routed all the feeds to a secure server that we could access remotely, turning my home into a fishbowl where every conversation, every gesture, every moment of apparent domestic bliss would be recorded for posterity. Play along, Derek advised as he finished installing the last camera. Make her think the poison is working. Act tired, complain about your heart racing. Let her think she's winning. The more confident she gets, the more likely she is to make a mistake. Meanwhile, Isla had another surprise for me. I want you to meet my sister, she said the next day. Tessa's a forensic accountant. If there's money involved in this, and there always is, she'll find it. Tessa was like a younger, more caffeinated version of Isla, with the kind of intense focus that you usually see in people who hunt serial killers for a living. She was skeptical at first, probably thinking her sister had dragged her into some kind of messy divorce drama. But that changed when she got a look at my financial records. Holy shit, she said, staring at her laptop screen like it had just revealed the meaning of life. Aaron, you've been hemorrhaging money for months. Look at this. Transfers to shell companies, investment accounts you didn't open, automatic payments to businesses that don't exist. She turned the screen toward me, pointing at line after line of transactions that I'd never authorized. $600,000, moved in small increments over the past several months, all going to companies with names like Meridian Holdings and Cross Creek Investments. It was like watching my financial life get dismantled one wire transfer at a time. This is sophisticated, Tessa continued, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she traced the money trail. Multiple layers of shell companies, offshore accounts, cryptocurrency conversions. Whoever's doing this knows exactly how to move money without leaving obvious tracks. But Tessa was better at her job than they were at hiding their crimes. Within hours, she'd connected the shell companies to a web of real estate investments, business partnerships, and bank accounts that all led back to one name, Maddox Rourke. He's got a condo in Nevada, bought with cash the same month you met Serena, Tessa explained, showing me property records and financial documents. Plus investments in 3 different companies that all seem to exist solely to launder money. This isn't just fraud, Aaron. This is a full-scale criminal enterprise, and you're their latest victim. I sat in Isla's apartment, surrounded by evidence of my own systematic destruction, and realized that I'd stumbled into something much bigger than a simple case of spousal homicide. This was organized crime with a domestic twist, complete with money laundering, identity theft, and murder for profit. But for the first time since this nightmare started, I wasn't alone. I had allies, people who believed me, people who were willing to help, people who understood that sometimes the person sleeping next to you is the most dangerous person in your life. The question now was whether we could gather enough evidence to stop Serena before she decided that slow-acting poison wasn't fast enough for her timeline. 3 days into living like I was starring in my own personal episode of Big Brother, Domestic Murder Edition, I'd almost started to convince myself that maybe we were all losing our minds. Maybe Serena really was just a loving wife who happened to look like a serial killer's mugshot, and maybe my ex-wife had watched too many true crime documentaries. Maybe I was having some kind of midlife crisis that involved paranoid delusions and an unhealthy obsession with herbal tea analysis. Then my phone buzzed at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a Thursday while I was sitting in a client meeting, pretending to care about quarterly projections when all I could think about was whether my wife was currently planning my funeral arrangements. The notification was from Derek's surveillance app, Motion Alert in the kitchen. I excused myself from the conference room, claiming I needed to take an urgent call, which wasn't technically a lie since finding out whether your spouse is a homicidal maniac probably qualified as urgent. I ducked into an empty office and pulled up the live feed on my phone, my heart doing that familiar jackrabbit impression that had become my body's default setting since this whole nightmare began. There was Serena, pacing around our kitchen like a caged animal, her phone pressed to her ear. She was wearing the blue sundress I'd bought her for her birthday, the one that made her eyes look like summer skies and had convinced me I was the luckiest man alive. Funny how context can completely destroy your perception of someone's wardrobe choices. The audio was crystal clear thanks to Derek's paranoid attention to detail. Serena's voice came through my phone speaker with the kind of clarity that made me wish I'd never asked for surveillance in the first place. He's suspicious, Maddox. Not drinking enough of the tea. I think that bitch ex-wife of his might have said something. I nearly dropped my phone right there in the middle of what was supposed to be a respectable accounting firm. Hearing your wife casually discuss your murder over the phone is the kind of experience that really puts those everyday work stresses into perspective. Suddenly, missing a deadline didn't seem quite so catastrophic. No, I haven't increased the dosage yet, Serena continued, running her free hand through her hair in frustration. We agreed on gradual escalation. But if he's not cooperating with the program, we might need to adjust our timeline. Our timeline, like my death, was some kind of project management situation that just needed better scheduling. I found myself taking notes, which probably said something disturbing about my psychological state. But at that point, I figured documentation was more important than maintaining my sanity. Maddox's voice was barely audible through the phone, but I caught enough to make my blood turn to ice water. Something about alternative methods and making it look accidental. Serena nodded along like they were discussing vacation plans instead of the best way to dispose of an inconvenient husband. If the tea doesn't work, we'll make it an accident, Serena said, her voice taking on the kind of casual matter-of-fact tone that people usually reserve for discussing the weather. All those power tools in his workshop, accidents happen all the time. Tables saw mishaps, electrical problems, carbon monoxide from that old generator he's always tinkering with. She'd been planning my death using my own hobbies. There was something particularly insulting about that, like she couldn't even be bothered to come up with an original murder method. Death by woodworking equipment. It was almost embarrassingly mundane for what was supposed to be a sophisticated criminal operation. The insurance payout is substantial, she continued, opening our kitchen cabinet with the kind of familiar ease that made me realize she'd probably been having this conversation in our house for weeks. $2 million, plus the life insurance from his business partnership. Split 3 ways like we agreed, minus operational expenses. Split 3 ways. So I wasn't just being murdered for love or passion or even simple greed. I was being murdered as part of a business partnership. My death was literally a line item in someone's budget spreadsheet. The indignity of it was almost worse than the actual murder attempt. Serena pulled out a small brown vial from behind the coffee filters, the kind of innocent-looking bottle that could have contained vanilla extract or essential oils or any number of harmless household substances. Instead, it contained what was apparently my personalized assassination blend, custom mixed for optimal cardiac failure. I'll increase the concentration tonight, she said, unscrewing the cap and examining the contents like a chef checking seasoning. Double dose should do it. If his heart doesn't give out by the weekend, we'll move to Plan B. Plan B. Because apparently, my murder was important enough to require backup strategies. I watched through my phone screen as she carefully measured liquid from the vial into our tea container, the same container I'd been drinking from every night for months. Her movements were precise, practiced, like she'd done this before. Which, according to Isla's research, she had. Multiple times. Don't worry about the ex-wife, Serena said, screwing the cap back on and returning the vial to its hiding place. Even if she suspects something, who's going to believe her? Bitter ex tries to sabotage new marriage with wild conspiracy theories? Please. Erin's too trusting, too in love to listen to her anyway. The casual confidence in her voice made my hands shake with rage. She was right, of course. A week ago, if Isla had come to me with this story, I would have assumed she was having some kind of breakdown. The idea that my loving, devoted wife was actually a professional black widow would have seemed completely insane. The call ended, and I watched Serena straighten up, smooth down her dress, and transform back into the woman I thought I knew. The woman who would greet me at the door with a kiss and ask about my day and express concern about my continued health problems. The woman who would hand me that poisoned tea with a loving smile and remind me to drink it all because she cared so much about my sleep issues. I sat in that empty office for another 10 minutes, watching her move around our kitchen like nothing had happened, preparing what looked like an early dinner. Probably something healthy and delicious, because even murderers apparently believe in maintaining nutritional standards. The cognitive dissonance was making my head spin. This was the same woman who left love notes in my lunch, who cried during romantic movies, who got excited about farmers market vegetables. That night, she made my favorite dinner, herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables, paired with a wine that probably cost more than most people's car payments. She lit candles, put on jazz music, and created the kind of romantic atmosphere that would have made me feel like the luckiest husband in the world if I hadn't spent the afternoon watching her plan my murder via kitchen cabinet. "You look tired, honey," she said, reaching across the table to touch my hand with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Maybe you should go to bed early tonight. I'll make you some extra strong tea." Extra strong, just like she'd promised Maddox. I forced myself to smile, to play the role of the unsuspecting husband who was grateful for such a caring wife. "That sounds perfect," I said, squeezing her hand back. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Which was technically true. Without her, I probably wouldn't be facing imminent death by herbal beverage. But I kept that observation to myself, because apparently, staying alive required better acting skills than I'd ever thought I'd need. When she handed me the tea that night, I held the warm mug in my hands and watched her face, memorizing every gesture, every expression of fake concern. She kissed my forehead and told me she loved me, and I told her I loved her too, because what else do you say to someone who's trying to murder you with chamomile and digitalis? The recording had captured everything. Her voice, her words, her casual discussion of my death like it was a minor inconvenience in her business plan. We had evidence now, real proof that would stand up in court. The question was whether we could use it to stop her before she decided that patience was overrated and power tools were more efficient than poison. You know what's worse than discovering your wife is trying to murder you? Trying to explain it to your lawyer without sounding like you've completely lost your grip on reality. I sat in Clara Jensen's office the next morning, surrounded by law books and diplomas that suggested she was qualified to handle everything from corporate mergers to custody battles, but probably hadn't encountered many cases involving herbal assassination attempts. Clara had been my attorney for 15 years, ever since I'd first started my business and needed someone to decipher the legal gibberish that passes for contracts these days. She'd handled my divorce from Isla, my business partnerships, even that time I'd gotten sued by a client who claimed my accounting software had given him carpal tunnel. But this was uncharted territory for both of us. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Clara said, adjusting her reading glasses and looking at me like I might need psychiatric evaluation. "You're telling me that your current wife is systematically poisoning you, has stolen over $500,000 from your accounts, and is part of a criminal organization that specializes in marrying and murdering wealthy men for their life insurance payouts." When she put it like that, it did sound pretty far-fetched. Like something you'd see on one of those crime shows where the plot twists are so ridiculous that even the actors look embarrassed to be saying the lines. But I had evidence now, recordings, financial documents, toxicology reports that didn't lie even if everything else in my life had turned out to be fiction. "That's exactly what I'm telling you," I said, sliding the manila folder across her mahogany desk. "And I've got proof of all of it." Clara opened the folder with the kind of cautious expression that lawyers get when they're about to see something that's either going to make their career or give them nightmares. She spent the next 20 minutes reviewing everything. Marcus's lab reports showing digitalis poisoning, Tessa's financial analysis tracking the stolen money, transcripts of Serena's recorded phone conversations discussing my imminent death like a quarterly business review. "Jesus Christ, Aaron," she whispered after reading through Serena's casual discussion of power tool accidents and double dosages. "This is attempted murder. Premeditated, calculated, documented attempted murder. We could take this to the police right now and have her arrested before lunch." The idea was tempting, I'll admit. There was something satisfying about imagining Serena being led away in handcuffs while she was probably at home planning what to wear to my funeral. But I learned enough about criminal organizations over the past week to know that arresting one person rarely solved the whole problem. Not yet, I said, which earned me a look that suggested Clara thought I might be developing Stockholm Syndrome with my would-be murderer. I need the full scope first. Serena's just the tip of the iceberg. There's Maddox. There are probably other victims, other operations. If we move too fast, we might only catch the small fish while the big ones disappear. Clara leaned back in her leather chair, the kind that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and studied me with the expression of someone trying to figure out if I was being brilliant or suicidal. Aaron, every day you wait is another day she could escalate. What if she decides poison isn't fast enough? What if she moves to Plan B? I'd been thinking about that possibility nonstop since hearing Serena's kitchen confession. The idea of becoming a statistic in some tragic workshop accident was keeping me awake at night, which was ironic since my sleep problems had started this whole mess in the first place. But I also knew that we needed to build an airtight case, something that would put away not just Serena, but everyone involved in what was clearly a much larger operation. I want to end this permanently, I told Clara. All of it. Every person involved, every shell company, every bank account. I want them to pay for what they did to me and what they probably did to other people who weren't lucky enough to have a paranoid ex-wife and friends in forensic accounting. Clara sighed, but I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. She'd built her career on complex cases, the kind that required strategy and patience and the ability to see 3 moves ahead. This wasn't just about saving my life anymore. This was about justice for victims who couldn't speak for themselves because they were dead. All right, she said finally. But we're not doing this alone. I'm calling in Detective Luis Moreno. He's with Boise PD, specializes in financial crimes and organized fraud. If we're going to build a case that takes down an entire criminal network, we need law enforcement involved from the beginning. Detective Moreno turned out to be the kind of cop who looked like he'd seen everything twice and wasn't impressed by any of it. He was probably 50, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that came from years of dealing with humanity's worst impulses. When Clara called him into our meeting, he listened to our story with the stone-faced expression of someone who'd heard stranger things before lunch. Black Widow operations, he said when we finished explaining the situation. We've been tracking similar patterns in 3 other states. Women who target recently divorced men, gain their trust, then systematically drain their assets while slowly poisoning them. Usually they move on before anyone gets suspicious, but it sounds like your wife got greedy. The casual way he discussed it made my skin crawl. This wasn't some unique nightmare that had happened specifically to torment me. This was a business model, a reproducible system for turning love into profit and marriage into murder. I was just another mark in what was apparently a well-established industry. How do we catch them? I asked, because sitting around discussing the sociology of spousal homicide wasn't going to keep me alive much longer. Moreno leaned forward, his expression shifting from bored professional to interested predator. We set a trap. Use you as bait. Let her think she's winning while we document everything. The money transfers, the communication with accomplices, the escalation in poisoning attempts. Build a federal case that includes conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder across state lines. The idea of using myself as bait in a murder plot wasn't exactly what I'd had in mind when I'd gotten up that morning, but it beat the alternative of ending up as another unexplained heart attack in someone's criminal resume. At least this way, I'd have backup. Meanwhile, Tessa had been busy following the money trail that connected Serena's operation to a web of financial crimes that spanned multiple states. She discovered that Maddox Rourke wasn't just a partner in my potential murder. He was the financial brain behind a network of shell companies that had been laundering money for years. He's got real estate investments in Nevada, Colorado, and Arizona, Tessa explained, showing us property records and incorporation documents. All purchased with cash, all generating rental income that gets funneled through cryptocurrency exchanges and offshore accounts. This isn't just about insurance fraud. They're running a complete money laundering operation. She'd also found something even more disturbing, records suggesting that my case wasn't unique. There were at least 3 other men who died under suspicious circumstances after marrying women who matched Serena's profile, and their insurance payouts had all been processed through companies connected to Maddox's network. This is bigger than we thought, Clara said. reviewing the evidence that kept growing like some kind of legal cancer. We're looking at a criminal enterprise that's been operating for years, possibly responsible for multiple murders, definitely responsible for millions in fraud and money laundering. Detective Moreno nodded, already making notes about federal agencies that would need to be involved. RICO predicates, he said, using cop shorthand that I didn't understand, but that made Clara's eyes light up. We can charge this as organized crime, which means longer sentences and asset forfeiture. Everything they've stolen, everything they've bought with stolen money, it all comes back to the victims. The scope of what we were building was starting to sink in. This wasn't just about stopping Serena from poisoning me. This was about dismantling an entire criminal operation that had been destroying lives for years. It was ambitious, complicated, and dangerous as hell. But for the first time since this nightmare started, I felt like we might actually win. You know what they say about the best-laid plans? Yeah, well, nobody ever mentions that when your plan involves using yourself as bait to catch a murderous wife, those plans tend to give you stress ulcers and a permanent case of the shakes. But here I was, 3 weeks into what Detective Moreno had cheerfully called Operation Honeypot, getting ready to spring the most elaborate trap of my life at the Meridian Grand Hotel. The plan was deceptively simple. Give Serena the perfect opportunity to finish what she'd started, while every moment was recorded by enough surveillance equipment to make the NSA jealous. Derek had spent 2 days turning our anniversary suite into something out of a spy movie, complete with cameras hidden in flower arrangements and microphones disguised as luxury toiletries. If we were going to catch a killer, we were going to do it in style. Setting the bait had been surprisingly easy. I'd come home from work the previous Tuesday, put on my best performance as the loving husband who was blissfully unaware that his tea came with a side of cardiac arrest, and suggested we celebrate our upcoming anniversary with a romantic weekend getaway. The Meridian Grand has a couples package, I told Serena over dinner, watching her face carefully for any tells. Champagne, room service, spa treatments. What do you say we splurge a little? Her reaction had been perfect. The kind of genuine delight that would have made my heart sing if I hadn't known she was probably calculating how much easier it would be to murder me in a hotel room where she could control the environment completely. Her eyes had literally lit up, like I'd just handed her the keys to my own execution chamber. That sounds absolutely perfect, she'd said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand with what appeared to be genuine affection. I'll pack the specialty blend. You've been sleeping so poorly lately, and I want to make sure you're comfortable. The specialty blend. Right. Because nothing says romantic getaway like bringing your own personally customized poison to the party. But I'd smiled and told her how thoughtful she was, because apparently my survival now depended on being a better actor than most people in Hollywood. The hotel suite was everything you'd expect from a place that charged more per night than most people made in a week. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a king-sized bed that could have housed a small village, and a bathroom with more marble than the Roman Colosseum. Derek had done his work well. Every angle was covered. Every conversation would be recorded, and Detective Moreno was waiting in the lobby with a full tactical team and enough warrants to arrest half the criminal underworld. Our dinner had been a masterpiece of romantic theater. Candlelight, wine that probably cost more than my first car, and conversation that would have seemed perfectly normal if you ignored the fact that one of us was planning to murder the other before dessert. Serena had been in rare form, charming and attentive, and so convincingly in love that I almost started to doubt my own evidence. To us, she'd said, raising her wine glass with a smile that could have melted steel. To our future together. I'd clinked glasses and echoed the toast, thinking about how our future together was likely to be measured in hours rather than decades. But I played my part, told her how lucky I was to have found her, how much better my life had become since she'd entered it. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife, but she ate it up like it was the finest cuisine. Back in the suite, that's when the real performance began. Serena disappeared into the bathroom with her overnight bag, emerging 15 minutes later in a silk nightgown that probably cost more than most people's rent. She'd brought her portable tea setup, a little travel kettle, her special blend, even honey from some boutique market that claimed their bees were happier than average. I made it extra strong tonight, she said, handing me the familiar mug with her familiar loving smile. For our special weekend. extra strong, just like she'd promised Maddox in that recorded phone call. I held the warm ceramic in my hands, inhaling the scent of chamomile and death, and felt the weight of everything that had led to this moment. All those nights of trusting her completely, all those mornings of waking up feeling worse instead of better, all those times she'd expressed concern about my health while systematically destroying it. This was it. The moment of truth, the climax of our twisted little domestic drama. I could drink the tea and potentially die, or I could refuse and blow our entire operation. But there was a third option, one that Detective Moreno had suggested during our planning sessions. I set the mug down on the nightstand, not taking a sip, and turned to face my wife with what I hoped was a convincing expression of confused concern. You know, Serena, I've been thinking about something that's been bothering me. Her smile faltered slightly, like a computer program encountering an unexpected input. What's wrong, honey? 2 mistakes, I said, my voice steady despite the fact that my heart was trying to escape through my throat. You made 2 mistakes, and I think it's time we talked about them. The change in her expression was immediate and terrifying. The loving wife mask slipped away like makeup running in the rain, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. For the first time since I'd known her, I was seeing the real Serena, or Vivian, or whatever her actual name was. What are you talking about? She asked, but her voice had lost its warmth. Now she sounded like someone trying to decide whether to run or fight. First mistake was underestimating my memory. I continued, pulling out my phone and opening the audio app where we'd stored the recording of her kitchen confession. I remember conversations, Serena, especially ones where my wife discusses the best way to murder me with her business partner. Her face went from confused to panicked to furious in the space of about 3 seconds. She lunged for my phone, but I was expecting it, had been coached by Derek on how to handle exactly this scenario. I stepped back, keeping the device out of her reach while her recorded voice filled the hotel room. If the tea doesn't work, we'll make it an accident. All those power tools in his workshop. And your second mistake, I said, raising my voice slightly because this was the signal we'd arranged, was smiling when you thought I should have been dead weeks ago. The word, now, appeared on my phone screen as I sent the pre-typed text to Detective Moreno. Within seconds, the hotel room door burst open like something out of an action movie. Officers in tactical gear poured in, weapons drawn, shouting commands that turned our romantic anniversary suite into a crime scene. Serena Clark, also known as Vivian Cross, Detective Moreno announced, stepping through the chaos with handcuffs already ready. You're under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and money laundering. What happened next was like watching someone's true personality explode out of them all at once. Serena, or whoever she really was, went from shocked to defiant to absolutely feral in the span of about 10 seconds. She screamed, she cursed, she tried to fight the officers restraining her, she denied everything while simultaneously threatening to sue everyone in the room. But the beautiful thing about evidence is that it doesn't care about your denials or your threats. The cameras had captured everything. Her casual preparation of the poisoned tea, her reaction when confronted, her complete transformation from loving wife to cornered predator. The financial records spoke for themselves, the toxicology reports didn't lie, and the recorded phone conversations were about as damning as evidence could get. As they led her away in handcuffs, still screaming about lawyers and false accusations and how much she'd loved me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Relief. Not just because I was going to live, but because the mask had finally come off completely. The woman I'd fallen in love with had never existed. What I'd been living with was a predator, a professional killer who'd gotten sloppy because she'd underestimated her mark. Standing in that hotel suite, surrounded by law enforcement and surveillance equipment, watching my wife get arrested for trying to murder me, I realized something profound. Sometimes the best way to save your own life is to become someone you never thought you'd have to be. Sometimes survival requires you to set a trap using yourself as bait. And sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys actually win. You know what's weird about watching your ex-wife try to murder you get prosecuted in federal court? The whole thing feels like you're watching a really twisted episode of Law and Order, except you can't change the channel, and somehow you're both the victim and the star witness in your own attempted murder case. 3 months after Serena's arrest at the Meridian Grand, I found myself sitting in a courtroom that looked exactly like every courtroom you've ever seen on TV, except the fluorescent lighting was worse, and the wooden benches were designed by someone who apparently believed that comfort was a sign of moral weakness. The federal courthouse in downtown Boise was the kind of imposing building that made you feel small just walking through the metal detectors. Marble floors, security guards who looked like they bench-pressed compact cars for fun, and enough American flags to stock a 4th of July parade. This was where justice happened, or at least where justice tried to happen while battling bureaucracy and legal technicalities. Serena, who was now legally identified as Vivian Cross, Sarah Martinez, Victoria Chun, and apparently about 6 other aliases that the FBI had uncovered during their investigation, sat at the defendant's table looking nothing like the woman I'd married. Gone was the soft, caring wife who made me tea and worried about my sleep patterns. In her place was someone harder, colder, wearing an orange jumpsuit that clashed with her complexion and an expression that suggested she was calculating the odds of everyone in the courtroom spontaneously combusting. The prosecution team was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, a woman who looked like she could argue with a brick wall and win. She'd spent the past 3 months building what she called an airtight case of premeditated murder for financial gain, which sounded a lot more impressive than "my wife tried to poison me" with herbal tea. But that's the thing about federal prosecutors. They have a way of making your personal nightmares sound like an episode of Criminal Minds. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Walsh began during her opening statement. Over the next several days, you're going to hear about a criminal enterprise that treats marriage as a business opportunity and murder as a profit center. The defendant, operating under multiple identities, has spent years perfecting a system of targeting, manipulating, and ultimately killing wealthy men for their life insurance payouts. She gestured toward a display board covered with photographs, mugshots, wedding pictures, death certificates, bank records. It looked like a serial killer's trophy wall, except everything was legal evidence instead of twisted souvenirs. This is not a crime of passion. This is not a marriage gone wrong. This is calculated, systematic murder for money, and Aaron Hartwell is lucky to be alive to tell you about it. The defense attorney, a guy named Robert Brennan, who probably charged more per hour than most people made in a month, had decided to go with the devoted wife-driven to desperation strategy. According to him, Serena was just a loving woman who'd gotten in over her head with some bad people, manipulated into actions she never would have taken on her own. It was a bold strategy, considering that we had recordings of her casually discussing power tool accidents and optimal dosing schedules. My client is not the criminal mastermind the prosecution wants you to believe, Brennan argued, gesturing towards Serena with the kind of theatrical flair that probably worked better in movies than in federal court. She's a victim herself, coerced by a criminal organization that preys on vulnerable women and forces them into impossible situations. The first witness was Isla, and watching my ex-wife testify about how my current wife had manipulated our marriage was like experiencing the most awkward family reunion in recorded history. Isla wore a navy blue suit that made her look professional and credible, and she spoke with the kind of careful precision that comes from months of preparation with federal prosecutors. She befriended me at a yoga class, Isla testified, her voice steady despite the fact that every word was being recorded for posterity. She asked questions about Aaron, his work schedule, his finances, his habits. At the time, I thought she was just being friendly, maybe a little nosy. I had no idea she was collecting intelligence for what amounted to a long-term assassination plan. Brennan tried to discredit Isla during cross-examination, suggesting that she was a bitter ex-wife trying to sabotage her former husband's new marriage. But the evidence spoke louder than his objections. The jury could see the pattern, could understand how someone might plant seeds of doubt in a marriage and then step in to comfort the grieving widower. Tessa took the stand next, armed with charts and financial records that made the money laundering operation look like a doctoral thesis in criminal accounting. She explained how the stolen funds had been moved through shell companies, converted to cryptocurrency, and ultimately used to purchase real estate and other assets that generated ongoing income for the criminal network. The defendant gained access to Mr. Hartwell's accounts through a combination of social engineering and identity theft, Tessa explained, pointing to a timeline that showed the progression of financial crimes. Over the course of 6 months, she systematically transferred over $600,000 to accounts controlled by her associates, always in amounts small enough to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts. Derek's testimony focused on the surveillance evidence, playing back audio recordings that filled the courtroom with Serena's voice discussing my murder like a quarterly business review. Listening to those recordings again, in front of a jury and a federal judge, made the whole thing feel surreal. This was my life they were discussing, my death that had been planned with the efficiency of a corporate merger. Dr. Marcus Hale explained the toxicology evidence with the kind of clinical precision that made poisoning sound like a chemistry experiment gone wrong. The defendant was administering digitalis glycosides in gradually increasing doses, he testified, showing the jury lab results that proved systematic poisoning. The progression suggests someone with knowledge of pharmacology, someone who understood how to induce cardiac failure while making it appear to be natural causes. Detective Moreno tied everything together, explaining how the investigation had uncovered a criminal network that spanned multiple states and involved numerous victims. He described other cases, men who died under suspicious circumstances after marrying women with similar profiles, insurance payouts that had been processed through the same financial networks, a pattern of behavior that suggested organized crime rather than isolated incidents. But the prosecution's star witness was Maddox Rourke himself, who'd been arrested 2 days after Serena and had quickly decided that cooperation was preferable to spending the rest of his life in federal prison. Maddox was exactly what you'd expect from someone who laundered money for a murder-for-hire operation, nervous, shifty, and apparently willing to sell out his business partners for a reduced sentence. It was a business, Maddox testified, refusing to make eye contact with Serena even though she was staring at him with the intensity of someone planning his eventual demise. We'd identify targets, recently divorced men with substantial assets and life insurance policies. Vivian would establish contact, usually through mutual friends or social situations, begin a relationship, and then systematically drain their resources while slowly poisoning them. He admitted to laundering funds from at least 7 different victims, including 2 men who died before becoming suspicious. The insurance payouts had totaled over $8 million, split between various members of the organization after operational expenses. My attempted murder wasn't personal. It was just another transaction in a very profitable business model. Serena's defense fell apart during cross-examination. When Walsh asked Maddox about Serena's role in planning the murders, he described her as the operational leader, the person who made decisions about timing, methods, and target selection. This wasn't a woman being coerced. This was a criminal entrepreneur who'd found a lucrative niche market. When Serena finally took the stand in her own defense, it was like watching someone try to rebuild a house of cards during an earthquake. She claimed to love me, insisted that everything she'd done was motivated by devotion rather than greed, and suggested that the recorded conversations had been taken out of context. According to her testimony, she'd been trying to protect me from Maddox and his associates, not murder me for profit. But Walsh's cross-examination was surgical in its precision. She played back recordings of Serena discussing dosage increases and backup murder methods, asked pointed questions about the stolen money and false identities, and systematically dismantled every aspect of the defense's narrative. By the time Walsh was finished, Serena looked less like a devoted wife and more like what she actually was, a predator who'd been caught in the act. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, which felt like 6 years while I sat in the courthouse cafeteria drinking coffee that tasted like burnt disappointment and watching CNN coverage of other people's disasters. When they finally returned with their verdict, the foreman stood up and delivered the words that made the past year of my life finally make sense. Guilty on all counts. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty of attempted murder. Guilty of wire fraud, money laundering, and identity theft. Guilty of being exactly what Isla had warned me she was. A professional killer who'd gotten sloppy because she'd underestimated her intended victim. The judge sentenced her to 30 years without the possibility of parole, describing her crimes as a calculated and systematic assault on the institution of marriage and the basic human right to safety within one's own home. Maddox got 12 years with eligibility for parole after 6, thanks to his cooperation and the prosecutor's recommendation. As I walked out of that courthouse, I realized that justice had been served, but it felt different than I'd expected. There was no dramatic sense of victory, no overwhelming relief. Just the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing that the truth had been told, the evidence had been heard, and 12 ordinary people had looked at the facts and decided that what happened to me was wrong. Months later, the restitution checks started arriving like awkward apologies from the universe. Tessa had worked some kind of forensic accounting magic and managed to recover most of my stolen money, $1.1 million out of the $1.3 million that had vanished into Serena's criminal empire. Clara secured additional damages that covered my legal fees, and then some. Apparently, attempted murder comes with a pretty decent settlement package when you've got solid evidence and federal prosecutors on your side. But here's the thing about money. It can't buy back sleep or trust or the ability to drink herbal tea without checking for poison first. I sold our house because every room reminded me of conversations that had been lies and gestures that had been manipulations. The new place was smaller, simpler, easier to secure. Derek had installed a security system that could probably detect a mosquito with criminal intent. I rebuilt my workshop in the garage, surrounding myself with tools that were supposed to kill me, but had instead become my therapy. There's something honest about wood and metal, something reliable about measuring twice and cutting once. Objects don't lie or plot or smile while planning your funeral. One winter evening, while I was putting the finishing touches on a walnut dining table, the mail brought an unexpected surprise. Prison stationery, Serena's handwriting, my name spelled out in the careful script of someone with too much time to think. I loved you. The letter began, because even convicted murderers apparently believe their own publicity. Everything I did was for us, for our future together. The money, the planning, it was all so we could be free, so we could start over somewhere new. Please visit me before my parole hearing. We need to talk. I read it once, sitting in my kitchen with a cup of coffee that I'd made myself, then carried it to the fireplace. Some words don't deserve to live longer than the flame it takes to destroy them. The paper curled and blackened, releasing whatever poison she'd tried to inject into my life one final time. Then it was ash, and I was free. Snow was falling outside my workshop window while I applied the final coat of finish to a walnut dining table that would probably outlast the family who'd commissioned it. Custom work for a young couple with their first house and big dreams about Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings. The kind of dreams I used to have before I learned that sometimes the person sitting across from you at dinner is calculating the optimal dose of digitalis for your evening tea. But that's the thing about wood, it doesn't lie. Walnut is walnut, no matter what name it goes by or what story it tells. You can trust grain patterns and joinery in ways you can't trust people. This table would hold their meals, their conversations, their arguments, and their reconciliations for decades to come, assuming they chose their spouses more carefully than I had. I carved a message into a hidden beam where only someone completely dismantling the table would ever find it. Justice doesn't beg. It builds its own door. Not profound enough for philosophy textbooks, but true enough for my current worldview. My phone buzzed occasionally, Derek checking in, Tessa sending updates about other victims getting restitution, Clara forwarding legal documents about appeals that wouldn't succeed. Even Isla called sometimes, not to relitigate our marriage, but to check that I was still breathing and hadn't developed any new suspicious symptoms. The irony wasn't lost on me that my ex-wife had saved my life by warning me about my current wife's murder plot. Marriage counselors probably don't cover that scenario in their training manuals. But then again, most people don't marry professional assassins who moonlight as loving homemakers. For the first time in months, my heart beat steady and strong. Not racing from poison, not skipping from stress, just alive in the basic, fundamental way that hearts are supposed to beat. Some people search their whole lives for that kind of peace. All I'd had to do was survive attempted murder and put my would-be killer in federal prison. The table was finished. Time to build something new. I overheard my wife's dad tell my wife, "Your husband? He doesn't deserve a dime, he's out of the company." I glanced at the mirror and just smiled. I walked away and moved. All my money from the offshores account I opened that night. But what they didn't know was, you know that feeling when you're walking down your own damn hallway and suddenly you're eavesdropping on your own funeral? Yeah, that was my Tuesday evening. I was heading to grab a bourbon from the study. Because apparently that's what passes for self-care when you're married into the Whitman dynasty. When I heard Richard's voice floating through the crack in the door, like poison gas under a hotel room threshold. Your husband? He doesn't deserve a dime. He's out of the company. The man said it with all the emotional investment of someone reading off a grocery list. Milk, eggs, bread, destroys son-in-law's entire career. Check, 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 and motherfucking check. I froze in that hallway like a deer caught in headlights, except this deer had been suspicious for months and was secretly packing heat. Here's the thing about moments that change your life. They don't come with dramatic music or slow-motion effects like in the movies. They come with the sound of your father-in-law's voice discussing your professional execution while you're standing in Italian marble hallways that your own sweat helped pay for. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a butter knife and serve it at one of Susan's charity luncheons. I leaned closer to the door, my heart doing this weird tap dance routine against my ribs. Through the gap, I could see Claire sitting there in that cream-colored chair she always claimed when she wanted to look innocent. Her perfectly manicured hands were folded in her lap, like she was attending a book club meeting instead of planning her husband's corporate assassination. "I understand, Daddy," she said, and her voice had that fake sweetness that used to make my stomach flutter during our dating days, but now made me want to check my life insurance policy. "It's for the best. For the best." Jesus Christ on a cracker. This woman was talking about destroying my livelihood like we were discussing which restaurant to hit for dinner. I wanted to burst through that door and demand answers. Maybe flip over Richard's precious antique desk and watch his golf trophies scatter like his integrity. But something stopped me. Call it survival instinct, call it plain old spite, but I stayed put and kept listening. Richard cleared his throat with the authority of a man who'd been making other people's decisions for 40 years. "The transition needs to be clean. No dramatic scenes, no messy confrontations. We'll handle it professionally." Professionally. That's rich, coming from a guy who'd been padding expense accounts and playing fast and loose with company funds for God knows how long. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. Same face I'd been living with for 32 years, but somehow it looked different now. Sharper. Like I was seeing myself clearly for the first time in months. Maybe years. My smile started small and grew wider, the kind of grin that would have made my old college buddies nervous during poker night. They thought I was invisible. That was their first mistake. See, here's what Richard Whitman and his precious daughter didn't know about me. I might have married into their world of country clubs and charity galas, but I grew up in a neighborhood where you learned to watch your back or you didn't make it to your next birthday. I'd been feeling the temperature drop in that house for months. Missed invitations to board meetings, sudden changes in family dinner plans, Claire's new habit of taking phone calls in other rooms like she was running some kind of covert operation. At first, I chalked it up to stress. Maybe Richard was just getting older. Maybe Claire was going through some kind of early midlife crisis. Hell, maybe I was being paranoid. But paranoia is just pattern recognition with a bad reputation, and I'd been recognizing patterns like a motherfucking savant. That night, after listening to my wife and father-in-law discuss my professional demise with all the passion of people planning a grocery run, I went upstairs to my home office. You know, the one Claire always complained was too cluttered, too masculine, too much like me. I sat down at my computer and pulled up some files that Richard definitely didn't know I had access to. Offshore accounts. Plural. The kind of financial cushions that paranoid guys like me set up when they marry into families where money flows like water and loyalty changes like the weather. I'd been moving assets around for months, small amounts at first, then bigger chunks as my spider senses started tingling louder and louder. By 3 a.m, I transferred every cent I could touch into accounts that Richard Whitman couldn't reach with a crane and a prayer. Private vaults, shell companies, investment portfolios scattered across 3 continents like breadcrumbs leading away from this house of cards they'd built around me. The beautiful thing about being underestimated is that people stop watching you carefully. They figure you're too dumb, too trusting, too in love to see the knife coming for your back. Claire used to joke about how I was too nice for my own good. Always said it with this little laugh that I now realize was probably her practicing for when she'd have to explain to her friends why her marriage fell apart. Well, surprise, sweetheart. Nice guys don't always finish last. Sometimes we finish prepared. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, looking out at the perfectly manicured lawn that Richard paid a crew of 12 to maintain twice a week. Tomorrow, I'd have to pretend I didn't know what was coming. I'd have to smile and nod and play the dutiful son-in-law for however long it took them to make their move. But tonight, I was going to pour myself that bourbon I'd been walking toward when this whole thing started, and I was going to toast to the beginning of the most expensive mistake the Whitman family had ever made. They wanted to cut me out? Fine. But they were about to learn that when you try to bury someone, you better make sure they're actually dead first. Because some of us, we're really good at digging our way back up. And when we do, we bring shovels. You know how they say hindsight is 20/20? Well, that's bullshit. Hindsight is more like having perfect vision while someone's beating you over the head with a baseball bat made of your own stupidity. Looking back now, I can see the writing on the wall, so clearly it might as well have been spray-painted in neon fucking pink with arrows pointing at it. The first sign should have been the board dinner in September. I remember it because Claire spent 3 hours getting ready, which was about 2 hours and 59 minutes longer than usual for a family business thing. She kept checking her phone, reapplying lipstick, asking me if her dress made her look serious enough. I should have known something was up when my wife started caring about looking serious for anything that wasn't a funeral or a tax audit. We showed up at the Riverside Club, that stuffy old money joint where the waiters still call you sir, and the steaks cost more than most people's car payments. I walked in expecting to see the usual setup. You know, the big round table where Richard holds court like some kind of corporate king, with all the board members arranged around him in order of ass-kissing importance. But when we got there, my fucking nameplate was missing. Not moved. Not repositioned. Gone. Like I'd never existed in the first place. I stood there for a hot minute, looking at the empty space where my seat should have been, feeling like I was in some twisted version of musical chairs where the music had stopped, and I was the only one left standing. The maitre d' kept apologizing, saying there must have been some clerical error, while Richard watched from across the room with the kind of expression you'd wear if you were watching someone step in dog shit. Don't worry about it, I told the guy, even though my stomach was doing backflips. I'll just grab a chair from another table. But here's the thing that really should have set off every alarm bell in my head. Claire didn't say a word. My wife, who normally would have raised hell if the waiter brought her the wrong color napkin, just stood there looking uncomfortable while her husband got relegated to the kids' table at his own company's dinner. I spent that entire evening sitting between some junior accountant who kept asking me about my future plans and the new IT coordinator who seemed genuinely confused about why I was there at all. Meanwhile, Claire was up at the main table, laughing at Richard's jokes and nodding along with Susan's stories about their latest charity bullshit like she belonged there, and I was just some +1 who'd wandered in off the street. That should have been clue number 1 that my marriage was heading south faster than a snowbird in October. Clue number 2 came in the form of company photos. You know those corporate headshots they take every year for the annual report? The ones that make everyone look like they're either constipated or planning a hostile takeover. Well, apparently I'd been digitally erased from more of those than a Soviet dictator who'd fallen out of favor. I discovered this little gem by accident when I was helping my buddy Jake move apartments. He'd worked in marketing at Whitman Global for about 6 months before jumping ship to a better gig, and he had a stack of old company materials in a box marked work shit to throw away. While we were loading his truck, I spotted a quarterly report from last year that had the whole executive team on the cover. Except someone had cropped me out. Not photoshopped, not digitally removed with fancy software. Literally fucking cropped. Like they'd taken scissors to the thing and cut around everyone else, leaving me in some alternate dimension where I apparently didn't exist. The photo showed Richard in the center, obviously, with Claire on his right, and the other board members arranged around them like planets orbiting the sun. And there, on the far left, was a sliver of what looked like a shoulder in a navy suit jacket. My shoulder. My suit jacket. My existence reduced to a fragment of fabric. Dude, isn't that you? Jake asked, pointing at the mysterious shoulder fragment. Used to be, I said, and I wasn't entirely kidding. But the real kicker, the sign that should have sent me running for the hills with my tail between my legs, came in the form of Claire's book club friends. These women were like a pack of suburban sharks, always circling around whatever drama they could sink their perfectly veneered teeth into. They'd been part of Claire's life since college, and they treated me with the kind of polite tolerance usually reserved for someone's embarrassing relative at a wedding. I overheard them talking at one of Susan's garden parties, standing around the champagne fountain like it was some kind of gossip confessional. They didn't see me because I was hidden behind one of those ridiculous topiary animals that Susan insisted on having scattered around the yard like some kind of botanical zoo. Claire's husband just isn't built for leadership, one of them was saying. I think it was Jessica, the one who married that hedge fund guy and thought it made her Warren Buffett. Some people are followers, you know? There's no shame in that. Richard's been so patient with him. Another voice chimed in. Probably Miranda, who collected husband failures like some people collect stamps. But at some point, you have to think about what's best for the company. And for Claire, Jessica added, and I could practically hear the fake sympathy dripping off her words like honey off a stick. She deserves someone who can match her ambition. I wanted to march over there and tell them exactly what I thought about their amateur psychological assessment of my leadership potential. But something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was masochism, but I stayed put and kept listening. Do you think she'll leave him? Miranda asked, and the question hit me like a punch to the gut. Oh, she won't have to, Jessica replied, and there was something in her voice that made my blood run cold. From what I hear, the problem's going to solve itself soon enough. That night, I went home and looked at Claire. Really looked at her, for the first time in months. She was sitting on our bed, scrolling through her phone with that concentrated expression she got when she was shopping online or planning someone's social destruction. The soft light from her screen made her look almost angelic, like some kind of digital Virgin Mary planning the crucifixion. How was the party? She asked without looking up. Educational, I said. She glanced at me then, and for just a second, I saw something flicker across her face. Guilt, maybe, or relief, or maybe just annoyance that I was still standing there when she obviously had more important things to focus on. But I didn't call her out. I didn't demand explanations or throw accusations around like confetti at a divorce party. Instead, I smiled and kissed her forehead and told her I was going to get some work done. Because by then, I was starting to understand that this whole thing was bigger than missing nameplates and cropped photos. This was strategy, carefully planned and precisely executed. Richard had been slowly erasing me from the company, and Claire had been letting it happen. Hell, she'd been helping it happen. So I went to my office and started making some strategies of my own. Because if they wanted to play games, I was more than ready to show them how it's done. Morning came like a hangover I didn't deserve, all bright and obnoxious, and full of possibilities that mostly involved me getting royally screwed over. I'd been up until 4 in the morning, putting together what I like to call my insurance policy, a nice, thick manila folder stuffed with enough evidence to turn Richard's comfortable little world into a smoking crater. The thing about rich people is they think they're invisible when they're stealing. They've got this weird delusion that money equals immunity, like having 7 figures in your bank account somehow makes you untouchable by little things like laws and consequences. Richard had been playing fast and loose with company funds for years, and he'd gotten so comfortable with it that he'd stopped being careful. Big fucking mistake. I showered, shaved, and put on my best "I'm totally not about to destroy your life" face before heading downstairs to what Susan always called the morning room. Like we needed a special room just for mornings, as if the rest of the house wasn't qualified to handle breakfast. The Whitmans had this thing about naming rooms like they were running some kind of domestic monarchy. Richard was already there, naturally, spread out at the head of the table like he owned the place. Which, to be fair, he did. For now. He had his reading glasses perched on his nose and spreadsheets scattered around him like some kind of financial war room. The man ate, slept, and breathed numbers, which would have been admirable if those numbers weren't mostly other people's money. Susan sat to his right, stirring her tea with the kind of precise, deliberate movements that screamed, "I'm pretending everything is normal." She'd mastered that particular skill over 40 years of marriage to a man who thought ethics were optional as long as the profit margins looked good. Her smile was already locked and loaded, the same one she wore to charity events when she was pretending to care about poor people. Claire was at the other end of the table, scrolling through her phone like she was conducting some kind of digital symphony. Probably checking her Instagram or texting her book club friends about whatever poor bastard they'd decided to crucify that week. She didn't even look up when I walked in, which was fine by me. I wasn't there for her anyway. "Good morning, family," I said, and I made sure to put just enough emphasis on that last word to make it sound like what it really was, a joke. Richard barely glanced at me over his glasses. "We're in the middle of something here," he said, gesturing at his precious spreadsheets like they contained the secrets of the universe. "Can whatever this is wait until after I finish reviewing these quarterly projections?" "No," I said, and I kept my voice level and friendly, like I was declining an offer for more coffee instead of refusing to be dismissed like some kind of hired help. "Actually, it can't." I pulled out the manila envelope I'd been carrying and set it down right in the middle of the table, between the croissants and the coffee mugs and Richard's carefully organized financial documents. The thing landed with a satisfying thud that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Susan's teaspoon stopped moving. Claire's thumbs froze over her phone screen. Richard's eyes locked onto that envelope like it might explode if he looked away. "What's this?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that hadn't been there a minute ago. Something that sounded almost like concern. "Open it," I said, settling into my chair and reaching for the coffee pot like I didn't have a care in the world. "I think you'll find it fascinating reading." Richard's hands moved toward the envelope with all the enthusiasm of someone reaching for a rattlesnake. He slid the contents out slowly, and I watched his face change as he started flipping through the pages. It was like watching someone age in real time, the color draining from his cheeks as the implications hit him. Bank statements, transaction records, copies of invoices for consulting services that had never been provided, wire transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands that definitely weren't listed on any tax returns, shell companies with names like Whitman Strategic Solutions and RW Holdings LLC that existed for exactly one purpose: moving money around like a three-card Monte game. "Where did you get these?" Richard's voice was barely above a whisper, and his hands were shaking just enough to make the papers rustle. "Does it matter?" I asked, taking a sip of my coffee. "The real question is whether you can explain them." Claire had finally looked up from her phone, and the expression on her face was priceless. It was like watching someone realize they'd been swimming with sharks and just noticed the fins circling. "What are those?" she asked, and her voice had that high, nervous quality it got when she was trying to laugh off something that wasn't funny. "Evidence," I said simply. Susan was still frozen with her teaspoon halfway to her mouth, staring at the papers like they might spontaneously combust. Her perfect composure was cracking around the edges, and I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. She was probably already figuring out which assets she could move offshore before the shit hit the fan. Richard was still flipping through the pages, his face getting redder with each new revelation. These are taken out of context," he sputtered, but his heart wasn't in it. We all knew what those documents showed, and context wasn't going to save him. "Really?" I leaned back in my chair and smiled. "Because it looks pretty straightforward to me. Company money going into personal accounts, fake consulting contracts, padded invoices for services that were never provided. Hell, there's even a receipt for a golf trip to Scotland that somehow got categorized as a client development expense." Claire's nervous laugh finally escaped, and it sounded like glass breaking. "This is ridiculous," she said, but she wasn't looking at me when she said it. She was looking at her father, and there was something in her eyes that looked a lot like panic. "You know what's ridiculous?" I asked, standing up and straightening my tie. "Thinking you could squeeze me out of this company without me noticing. Thinking I was too stupid or too trusting to see what was happening. Thinking you could have your little meeting last night, and I'd just roll over and take it." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Richard's mouth was moving, but no sound was coming out. Susan had finally set down her teaspoon, and her hands were clenched so tight her knuckles were white. Claire was staring at me like she'd never seen me before, which was probably closer to the truth than she realized. "See, here's the thing about being underestimated," I continued, walking around the table toward the door. "People stop paying attention to what you're doing. They figure you're harmless, so they get sloppy. They leave paper trails. They forget to cover their tracks. They have conversations in rooms where the doors aren't quite closed." I paused at the threshold and turned back to look at them. 3 generations of Whitman privilege, sitting there in their expensive clothes at their expensive table in their expensive house, finally understanding that money couldn't buy them out of this particular problem. "Enjoy your breakfast," I said. "I've got some phone calls to make." I walked out of that room with my head high and my conscience clear. leaving behind three people who were just beginning to understand that their carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down around their ears. And honestly, it felt fucking fantastic. That afternoon, I drove to Whitman Global's headquarters with the kind of calm that comes right before you drop a nuclear bomb on someone's carefully constructed reality. The building rose up from downtown like some kind of glass and steel middle finger pointed at the sky, 43 floors of corporate ambition and questionable ethics. I'd walked through those revolving doors 1,000 times before, but today felt different. Today, I wasn't walking in as Richard Whitman's son-in-law. I was walking in as the guy who was about to own his ass. The elevator ride to the 38th floor felt like it took forever and no time at all. I could see my reflection in the polished steel doors, and I looked good, confident, like a man who'd just discovered he held all the cards in a game everyone else thought they were winning. My suit was pressed, my tie was straight, and my briefcase was full of enough legal dynamite to level the entire Whitman empire. The boardroom was exactly what you'd expect from a company that spent more on office furniture than most small countries spent on education. Mahogany table the size of a small aircraft carrier, leather chairs that probably cost more than a decent car, and windows that offered a view of the city that screamed, "We own this place." The partners were already seated when I walked in, and the looks on their faces were priceless. Harold Green was at his usual spot, third chair from the head of the table, looking like he'd rather be getting a root canal without anesthesia. Harold was old-school corporate, the kind of guy who still wore suspenders and thought handshake deals meant something. He'd been with the company since Dirt was young, and he had this annoying habit of trying to see the good in everyone, even when everyone included people like Richard Whitman. Linda Torres was across from him, her laptop open and her fingers already dancing across the keyboard like she was conducting some kind of digital orchestra. Linda was the numbers girl, the one who could spot financial irregularities from 3 miles away, but somehow hadn't noticed that her boss had been cooking the books for years. Either she was incredibly bad at her job or incredibly good at looking the other way. There were a few other faces around the table, junior partners, department heads, people whose names I'd learned over the years, but who'd never quite managed to look at me like I belonged there. Today, that was about to change in a big fucking way. "Gentlemen." "Linda," I said, setting my briefcase down and taking a seat at the far end of the table. Not in my usual spot, the chair that had always been designated for the son-in-law who was there out of courtesy rather than competence. Today, I sat where I damn well pleased. "This is unexpected," Harold said, and his voice had that careful neutrality that older guys use when they're trying not to step on any landmines. "Richard didn't mention you'd be joining us today." "Richard doesn't know I'm here," I replied, opening my briefcase with the kind of deliberate precision that made everyone in the room lean forward slightly. But that's about to be the least of his problems. I pulled out a stack of documents that I'd had my lawyer prepare that morning. Legal papers, transfer documents, certificates that looked official as hell because they were official as hell. The kind of paperwork that changes ownership and shifts power and turns comfortable assumptions into expensive mistakes. "As of last week," I said, sliding copies of the documents around the table like I was dealing cards in the world's most expensive poker game, "I control 52% of this firm's voting shares." The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop from space. Harold's reading glasses slipped down his nose. Linda's fingers stopped moving over her keyboard for the first time since I'd met her. One of the junior partners, I think his name was Stevens, actually choked on his coffee. "That's impossible," Harold said, but his voice was shaky and he was already reaching for the papers I'd slid his way. "Actually, it's not," I said, settling back in my chair like I owned the place. Which, technically, I now did. Turns out there was a trust that Richard set up about 15 years ago, back when he was feeling generous and thought I'd never be smart enough to find it. Shares held in escrow, contingent on certain performance metrics and company milestones. Metrics that were quietly satisfied last quarter. The beautiful thing about rich people is they love their legal loopholes and tax shelters so much that they sometimes forget what they've created. Richard had been so busy building his financial house of cards that he'd lost track of a few of the building blocks. The trust had been his idea, a way to keep family shares from being diluted while still maintaining the appearance of bringing me into the fold. He'd probably figured I'd never be smart enough to understand what it meant, let alone savvy enough to activate it. Wrong on both counts, Daddy dearest. Linda was speed reading through the documents like her life depended on it, which it probably did. These signatures, the dates, this is all legitimate, she said, and she sounded like she was announcing someone's terminal diagnosis. Of course it's legitimate, I said. I had the best lawyer's money could by spend 3 weeks making sure every I was dotted and every T was crossed. Amazing what you can afford when you're not spending your money on fake consulting fees and Cayman Island golf trips. That's when Richard burst through the boardroom doors like some kind of corporate Incredible Hulk, his face red enough to stop traffic and his expensive suit wrinkled from whatever panic spiral he'd been having since breakfast. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he bellowed, pointing at me like I was some kind of trespasser instead of the guy who'd just become his boss. "Having a board meeting," I said calmly. "You're welcome to join us, but you might want to sit down. We have a lot to discuss." "Security," Richard shouted toward the door. "Get this man out of here." That's when I stood up and pulled out the second set of documents from my briefcase. These ones were even more fun than the first batch. Bank records, transaction histories, copies of invoices for services that had never been provided, and consulting fees for consultants who didn't exist. Evidence of every dirty deal, every padded expense account, every piece of creative accounting that Richard had thought was buried deep enough to stay hidden. "Before you call security," I said, passing around this new set of papers like party favors, "you might want to take a look at these. Transaction reports showing payments to your personal gambling debts disguised as client expenses. Offshore transfers through shell companies with names that sound suspiciously like your golf buddies. Consulting contracts for firms that exist only on paper and in your imagination." The room went so quiet you could have heard Richard's blood pressure spiking. Harold was staring at the papers like they might catch fire. Linda was typing furiously, probably already calculating how much trouble the company was in. The junior partners were looking back and forth between